Okay, so let's break it down a bit and look at some of these aspects of gender. And I'm going to go from kind of the smallest or the most localized within a person to the largest and most sort of socially, almost said persuasive, pervasive is what I mean. So we'll start with identity or gender as experienced or understood by individuals. So gender identity can be defined as individual self-awareness, where human beings are among the few animals that are aware of themselves and think about themselves and think about who they are, which is why we're probably among the few animals, possibly the only animals, who can be said to actually have a gender in the sense of an identity. And the gender identity that we possess is, like Marx said, something we make ourselves, but not always under circumstances of our own creation. And that means that we understand ourselves as gendered beings. We answer that question, who am I, in terms of gender, in relation to the gender categories that are available for us to identify with. So for ages and ages, the gender categories were male, female, masculine, feminine. You're one or the other. In other contexts, in other cultures, as we've seen in the last lecture, the available gender categories are much more diverse and much broader, and may in fact not be rigidly bounded categories at all. People can kind of move amongst them. Nonetheless, wherever you happen to be, the gender categories that are dominant or that are most prevalent in the world around you will inform how you construct your own identity as a gendered person or how you understand yourselves to be. So the available answers to that who am I question are quite variable. And the meanings associated with any particular gender identity also vary. So identifying as understanding oneself to be female may be very different if you're talking about, let's say, growing up in a small town in Saskatchewan in the 1950s versus, let's say, being an elderly nun in Portugal in the 16th century. I'm just, completely making these things up. In both cases, the common thing is an identification as, or a knowledge of oneself as female, as feminine. But what goes along with that, all the things that are available to you and not available to you, and the ways that you experience the world may be completely different. So the meanings associated with any particular gender identity are also quite variable across time and space. Here's a slightly fun example of that, which is this idea that pink and blue are gendered colors, and therefore, especially with young children, they get applied to lots of stuff. I mean, go into any service place that sells products for babies or children, and you'll see the wall of pink with some purple going on, and you'll see the wall with blue and some brown going on, and you'll see how closely these colors have been fused with the idea of developing a gender identity in children of various genders. What's probably not really surprising, actually, is that this association of pink with a particular identity and blue with another one is both historically recent, wasn't always that way, and it's culturally contingent, which means that it's not inevitable or necessary or it has to be this way. It just kind of randomly happens to be this way. Indeed, 100, 200 years ago, the gendering of these colors was flipped. And pink, as you see from this quote here from an infant wear catalog in the early 20th century, pink was considered to be a more suitable color for boys because pink was kind of like the slightly diluted version of red. And red was the color of courage and bravery and valor. It had associations with the battlefield and strength and fearlessness. And so, for all of those reasons, a slightly diluted version of red was appropriate for little boys, because those were masculine qualities, and that was what little boys should grow up to be. For girls, particularly in countries that were strongly Catholic, blue was considered more appropriate, not only because it's, as the quote here says, delicate and dainty, but also because it's the color that's traditionally associated with the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was held up as the sort of paradigm, the ideal woman that all young girls and women could aspire to be within Christian societies. So blue, reminiscent of Mary, was appropriate for girls, whereas pink, which was kind of gestured towards red and valor and bravery and so forth, was, of course, the color for boys. I tried to figure out or to find out how these got flipped and how pink became the girl color and blue became the boy color. And the short answer is nobody really seems to know, but it appears to have happened sometime after the Second World War-ish, which is also the time, and this is tying gender into other social phenomena, also a time of great prosperity and domesticity, at least in North America and Canada and the United States, and the proliferation of consumer products and commodities to purchase. So just as more and more things were being made for people to buy for the homes, more and more products for children were being produced. And if you want, your typical baby boom family might have 3 or 4 kids. If you're a manufacturer and you want to sell them stuff, you don't want them reusing the same hand-me-downs from the oldest kid for the younger ones. So you start making clothes that are just for girls, little girls, and just for little boys. So people, in effect, have to buy maybe twice as many baby clothes. And with the proliferation of special clothes and blankets and things like that just for babies and young children, the entrenchment of girl things and boy things became stronger and stronger until today. It's just kind of gone berserk. It's quite alarming, actually, to see how gender coded, particularly by color, items for children have become that really don't, there's no need for them to be gender coded. There's no need for them to be color coded, except that that's a way to sell more of these things. So anyway, that was a little bit of a side rant about how gender intersects with capitalism in various ways. The point here is that gender identity, pink and blue, is not an inevitable or natural or universal thing. It is an example of the meanings associated with particular gender identities that can change across time and place. Another way of looking at gender is through the lens of gendered interactions. And this is an approach that sociologists often describe as ethnomethodology, or more colloquially as the, air quotes again, doing gender approach. So let's take a bit of a look at that. So this approach holds that people do gender. Gender is more like a verb. It's not necessarily something that you have or possess as some essential trait. It's a thing that you do with other people through the way you interact with them and through the way they interact with you. Gender, and particularly gender differences, are recreated through repeated interactions, which could be face-to-face, it could be online, mediated by a screen, it could be collective, it could be individual, but it's these repetitious engagements between people that accomplish or achieve gender. The picture you got here is from one of our more extremely gendered and also very recent rituals, which is the gender reveal party, when people who are going to have a baby throw a big party at which they announce, is it going to be a boy or is it going to be a girl? And if you wanted to study how gender is constructed and reconstructed and maintained through interactions, you could probably find no better way to look at it than the rise of gender reveal parties. Now, doing gender, interacting and manifesting or recreating gendered ideas and ways of being, scholars argue, requires an understanding of both sameness and different. So sameness means the understanding that everybody within a particular gendered category somehow has something in common, something that makes them in some ways the same. And that also difference exists, difference between gender categories. If you're one, you're not the other. This is probably familiar to you from the sort of exclusive, exhaustive, derived from the body theory of gender that we talked about earlier. So people who study the doing of gender look at ways in which sameness within gendered categories is maintained or constructed or created and recreated, and difference between gender categories is similarly maintained, constructed, recreated, and so forth. Here's a couple of examples. We'll take difference first. That there at the top of the screen is Arnold Schwarzenegger, as he was a couple decades ago. He's a little more grizzled now. And this is from one of his political campaigns. He was declaring that he's independent, he's autonomous, he's his own man, nobody tells him what to do. And he said in one of his speeches, if his political opponents don't have the guts to come up here in front of you and say, I don't want to represent you, I want to represent those special interests, the unions, the trial lawyers. If they don't have the guts, I call them, drumroll, girly men. So Schwarzenegger here is doing difference as a way of reinforcing a gendered identity. There's him, and then there's these others, these men who are really more like girls because they're feminized, they don't have guts, they don't tell the truth, they don't actually want to represent the people. So he's using difference as a way of maintaining gender through his interaction in the form of speeches and rallying his supporters to vote. And the picture below is an example of an extreme, admittedly quite extreme example of gender as sameness. That's Joan Crawford, the movie actor from the early 20th century, mid 20th century, and her daughter. They're dressed identically to signal. This is a publicity photo. Obviously, they presumably didn't go around, just hanging out at home dressed like that. They're dressed to signal to an audience of their fans, publicists, that they are feminine in a very particular way. And the little girl is going to, the implicit promise here, she's going to grow up to be like her mom, ruffles and skirts and having her hair and makeup done and so forth. So they're doing gender in the form of sameness. This is what femininity looks like. We all possess it here. So there's a couple of examples of gender as sameness and as difference. Another key concept in the approach to gender, which stresses interaction or doing gender, is the notion of that gender has to be achieved. And that achievement is never complete. So gender is never just like, okay, this person's a boy and they're masculine and there you go, or this person is a girl and they're feminine and there you go, that's the end of it, that's the end of the story. But it It is constantly being evaluated. Gender is at risk of judgments as to whether people are doing it appropriately or inappropriately. So rather than a characteristic that you just possess and that's all there is to it, the people who follow the doing gender approach would say doing gender is work. It's a constant, it's not just an ascription to a category, it's a constant work of achievement. And another celebrity example here, this one may be getting a little bit old. I'm going to assume you know who Angelina is and who Shiloh is. This celebrity magazine is getting hopes that its readers will be really, shocked and horrified by the idea that Angelina, is turning Shiloh into a boy by dressing Shiloh in boys' clothes, by giving Shiloh a boy's name. Angelina is being called out as a bad mother, obviously. Good mothers wouldn't have this on the cover of Life and Style, who is putting her child's achievement of gender at risk by kind of pushing the child into gender inappropriate, at least in the minds of the editors of Life and Style, gender inappropriate appearance and behavior. So Shiloh's little shirt and sweater and short haircut and so forth is here to be read as inappropriate. Why is a girl being forced to dress like, in huge capital letters here, a boy? This is an example of gender achievement that's kind of gone sideways. It's been knocked off course, and it's obviously meant to be read as very inappropriate, very destabilizing, especially in light of, we look at all the other extremely gendered examples of happy cisgendered heterosexual individuals that frame the picture of Shiloh on the cover of this magazine. And then we get to gender as an institution, or as an aspect of institutions through which gendered inequalities are perpetuated, are reproduced, or exacerbated. So here's where we're going to get into some, we're going to get to Statistics Canada and get into a few numbers and bits of statistical information to show how institutions such as the Canadian workforce can be described as gendered in terms of their outcomes, even though, as your textbook has stressed, on the surface, they appear to be gender neutral. So before we get there, just a bit of clarification. When we talk about institutions as gendered or producing unequal outcomes, we're really talking about constraints and opportunities that people experience in these institutions, whether that's the University of Alberta or a faith organization could be seen as an institution, a sports team. There's, I won't even get into the literature on what is a social institution. It will be sufficient to say that we're mainly looking at how constraints and opportunities, which together make up power, are distributed within these institutions. So people who do institutional analyses of gender are asking questions like, who does what? The division of labor. Who is actually, like, day-to-day doing what tasks? Who controls which resources? And this might be money, this might be land, this might be something else that's considered valuable. It might also be authority, the power to tell other people what to do, or how to tell other people how to do what they do. Who carries which responsibilities? Who is expected to take it on themselves, or who does take it on themselves to ensure that certain things happen? Who is responsible for what? Who can walk away from what and who has to deal with what. So responsibility is kind of the flip side of power. And who experiences what outcomes. When we look at the end of the day at how people's lives are affected or changed by institutions, how are the effects of the institution differentially distributed amongst groups of people? You know, who gets what kind of outcomes from a particular institution? Now jumping to the Canadian workforce, I could have used pretty much a vast range of examples, but I'm going to use the Canadian full-time workforce. It can be described as, or it can be understood through a structural analysis of gender when we look at where men and women, those are the two gender groups that are tracked in Statistics Canada information, where they end up within the labor force, with what sorts of responsibilities and what types of opportunities and constraints. I'll talk about this in a lot more detail in future lectures, so here's just a few bits of information. In terms of distribution within the workforce, there's something that sociologists of labor often refer to as, quote unquote, the 5 C's. And the 5 C's refer to 5 occupational categories, which are the ways that Statistics Canada or the US Census classifies occupations within a workforce: caring, clerical, cashiering, cleaning, catering. And these 5 occupational categories are where you find women full-time workers concentrated within Canada. This is also what's referred to sometimes as the pink collar ghetto, which is a term that we'll get to in future weeks. So as of 2015, of women who were employed full-time in Canada, over half of them were concentrated in these 5 C's versus less than 1 in 5 men. So we have an unequal and a very gendered distribution of people within the Canadian workforce. And it probably will come as no surprise to you to know that these 5 C categories are among we have the lowest, among the lowest paying and most precarious jobs within the Canadian workforce. So if you're looking for, being paid well for the hours that you put in and being pretty secure in your job and having a sort of a ladder that you can move up in your job, you're probably not looking at the 5 C's. If you're looking for work that you can kind of sequence with unpaid work in the home, or work that you can sort of stop and start, low barriers to entry, low barriers to exit, in order to work with your unpaid responsibilities as a primary caregiver, that's when you might be looking at the 5 C's as the occupational niche that you will be in. So there's an example of distribution within occupations where we see it's strongly influenced by gender, and the majority of women are stuck in occupations that are typically lower paying and less secure than where the majority of men end up. Even another example from Canadian labor force data, even when we look at within a particular occupational sector, we see that gender stratification is still there. If we look at the occupational sector that Statistics Canada classifies as food services, we see that among the subcategory chefs and cooks, which is the most highly remunerated group within this broad sector called food services, 60% of the people in those jobs are male. When we look at other subcategories within the food services sectors, people whose jobs are classified as kitchen helpers, counter attendants, which means basically sort of fast food customer service facing, like working at Tim Hortons or a McDonald's or something. Food support staff, and food servers, we find that only 30% of the people in these jobs are male. So even within a single occupational sector, men are clustered in, or men dominate the higher paying jobs within that sector, and women dominate the more precarious contingent and lower paying jobs. And that's an example of gender manifesting through inequalities within an institution.